To be a high-level thinker, you don't have to have all the answers. Instead, you have to learn how to ask the right questions, and a statistical rule called the central limit theorem helps you achieve this. After spending years as an internationally published academic and entrepreneur, I've noticed 3 ways top performers apply this rule in their everyday lives to help them cut through the noise and think more clearly and objectively than everyone else. The good news, however, is that these are simple, and mastering just one of them could change your life. So let's start with the first. The first way the central limit theorem helps us think more objectively is by giving us a more accurate understanding of success versus failure. Back when I started my first business in 2013, which was heavily focused on front-facing sales, I had absolutely no skills in this area. Up to that point, I had been purely an academic, focused on nothing but theory and almost never socializing with anyone. I was a total introvert, still am. So what do you think happened when I started doing sales appointments? Yeah, you guessed it. But you have no idea how bad it actually was. It took me 66 appointments to make my first 2 sales, and at some points I went through as many as 80 or 100 appointments without a single sale. Yes, I was very bad at this. Sure, I could have given up, but it was at that point that I started to leverage my academic background in value theory to put things in perspective. You see, the central limit theorem states that as a sample size grows, it takes the shape of what's called a normal curve. And we can see this everywhere in nature. Whether it's with the probability of getting heads or tails from a coin flip, the probability of finding the perfect romantic partner, the probability of getting a job you apply to, or in my case, the probability of closing a sale, the most probable result, which in most of these cases is rejection or hearing the answer no, centers around the mean or average. So then, how exactly did I use this knowledge? Well, the most obvious conclusion I made was that both very successful results and very bad results were rare and improbable, and that no matter what action I took, I was pretty much guaranteed to get rejected the vast majority of the time. It had very little to do with me not being good enough or worthy enough. Instead, it was simply a law of probability that everyone else in the world was subject to also. A small percentage of the time, however, I would be very successful, and those few successes made up for all of the failures. In a very real sense, then, I realized failing, and failing a lot, was a necessary pathway to those few successes. But it went even deeper than this realization. You see, if we take a closer look at the normal curve here, what we see is that only a little more than 2% of results are extraordinary. 2% of people become extraordinarily wealthy, 2% of people find that perfect dream job, 2% of people find their perfect romantic partner, and so on. But then I remembered a law of probability contained within the central limit theorem also, regarding what's called independence of events. Take a look at these 2 equations, and to understand them, let's use the example of a coin flip. The first equation means that 2 events, in this case 2 separate coin flips, are independent, or essentially they are unaffected by any other variables besides the simple fact that they are both fair coins. I mean, think about it. A coin flip is a coin flip. Nothing but the fact that they are both coins is going to affect whether they come out as heads or tails. But let's take a look at the second equation here. And let's look at, say, the example of applying for and getting your dream job. This equation tells us that 2 events, i.e. one person getting their dream job versus another person getting rejected from their dream job, are affected by variables outside of them simply being human beings. And wouldn't you agree that people are more complex than coin flips? Well, I applied this same logic to my understanding of the normal curve at that time and concluded the following. The normal curve I'm creating to model my results is misleading. Not all of the people in this sample should be grouped the same way. All this time, I've been simply assuming that all of the people who sell these products should actually be grouped together in the same sample in the first place. But what if those top 2% who get extraordinary results have some specific differences that are drastically different from those bottom 98%? Are they learning certain skills? Did they start their businesses with a certain level of capital? Do they have a certain kind of social network? What other factors may actually make them different from others in the sample? These are important questions, but it's very easy to make a huge mistake here. It's actually an invalid inference to simply look at what those 2% are doing and simply try to copy it. That is what is called survivorship bias, a dangerous fallacy I actually fell into. A more objective approach would be the following. Number 1, identify all factors that those 2% have in common. It could be things you can't personally control, such as their background, age, social status, inherited wealth, etc., as well as things that you could conceivably control, such as their network, their experience, their skill level, and so on. Number 2, do the same for all factors the 98% have in common. What commonalities do you see? There are certain ones you probably can't control and which are genuinely unfair. Race, gender, age, inherited wealth, and so on. But there are likely other factors you can control. And so if you're gonna pursue any opportunity, whether that's a job, a business, a relationship, your best shot at succeeding is probably going to be in both pursuing the common traits of the 2% and avoiding the common traits of the 98%. Not just in looking at the 2% and doing what they do. There's a big difference. And this difference in thinking made a huge impact on my business at that time. If you want to take a deeper dive into critical thinking tools like this, then check out the free masterclass in the pinned comment below. And this difference leads us straight into the second way the central limit theorem helps us think more clearly and objectively, and that is with respect to setting goals and action plans for those goals. You see, one key principle embedded within the central limit theorem is that as the sample size grows, the statistics observed within the normal curve become more accurate. Translation? The larger the numbers, the more accurately we can predict the results. In my first business, I realized I had fallen into the trap of what's called the sunk cost fallacy. I was making decent money at a certain point, but I was putting in so much effort to maintain that result. In my head, I thought to myself, but I can't quit now. Then all of my time and effort to build this will have been wasted. But it's this kind of sunk cost fallacy thinking that can lead us to keep doing something for years that doesn't truly serve us. And so in my second business, which was a standardized test prep agency, I decided not to make that same mistake. For this business, I decided to set a time limit. I told myself, if I don't make a certain amount of income by a certain amount of time, then I'll stop. But even if you're setting time limits like this, you're still probably making this second mistake that will completely sabotage you. You see, according to the central limit theorem, it's not really fair to say you failed at something, a sport, a business, an exam, if you haven't put in large amounts of numbers. Or in other words, unless you've created lots and lots of data points. So for whatever you're working on, your task is twofold. 1, commit to a time frame you will pursue your goal, and then 2, actively build out your own normal curve by creating as many data points within that time frame as you can. This might look like lots of appointments if you're in sales. This might look like lots of study time, office hours, and practice problems if you're a student. Or this might look like lots of job applications if you're pursuing a job. Even after 100 data points, it's often hard to see a trend. Don't limit yourself. The biggest mistake I made when I started my first business was to do 10 appointments and then conclude I was a failure. But objectively speaking, that's simply not enough data to make any kind of conclusions at all. And that should make you feel a lot better. Go for 1,000, 10,000. However many data points you can create, the more accurate your data will be, the lower the variability in the data will be, and the more accurately you'll be able to predict your next actions based on those data. But the use of the central limit theorem isn't limited to mapping out your success trajectory. It's also a powerful tool to prevent you from making decisions based on false beliefs. Specifically, it helps us avoid what's called anecdotal thinking and establish a burden of proof for claims. You see, throughout our lives, we're often faced with situations in which we're asked to prove something. For instance, what if someone tells you, I spent 20 hours crafting this report. You can look for evidence of this pretty easily. I mean, you can look at the number of pages in the report, you could look at the citations and research required for it, and you could probably give an estimate of how many hours went into it. But what if someone asks you to prove the opposite? What if, in this case, their report is barely 1 page long with no research citations, and to your mind, it's obviously less than 20 hours of work, given your knowledge of their capabilities? Well, in this case, you might use this basic evidence to reply that it looks like it took far less than 20 hours. But then they argue the case with you. No, it took me 20 hours to do, and anyway, you can't prove it didn't take me that long. In this case, you're being challenged to do what's called proving a negative. And you might have heard somewhere that you can't prove a negative, but that's not really true. I mean, if I'm camping and I want to prove there isn't a bear in a cave nearby, I can probably enter the cave, look for footprints, and so on and so on and so on. So it is definitely not unreasonable to be asked to prove a negative. It's only in certain very specific cases that it is unreasonable to be asked to prove a negative. And here's where the central limit theorem helps us, by helping us to establish an objective and clear burden of proof. And this works well to prevent yourself from being gaslit and also to help communicate more effectively in tense situations. So then, how do you overcome the objection that, no, it took me 20 hours to do it anyway, you can't prove it didn't take me that long? Again, we have to revisit the normal curve. This time, let's create a normal curve representing the average time it takes for a report to be done that has no citations, is only 1 page long, and was written by someone with a college education. Okay, so what do we observe here? Well, the mean here, which as we should recall represents the most likely result, is 1 hour. And if we look a full 3 standard deviations to the right, or in other words, roughly 0.1% of the time, we see that it takes 20 hours. This is a highly unlikely result. And so, unlike our bear example, which arguably is a lot more likely to find around a campsite, you would be justified in not having to provide any evidence or having to submit to this person's demand that you prove their negative. Because the default view is the most likely one, you do not have the burden of proof. Instead, it is they who have the burden of proof simply because the truth of their claim is highly unlikely. And this is a similar reason for why you don't have the burden of proof when people tell you things such as a global secret society covertly rules the world, vaccines cause autism, or the 2020 election was stolen. All of these claims essentially ask you to prove a negative, and since there's actual data representing the most likely outcomes we see, although any unlikely claim could actually be true, it is not your burden of proof to show it is. So how will you start using the central limit theorem in your daily life? Can you see how using this rule helps us gradually achieve clearer thinking and personal self-mastery? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.